So that's all great news, and obviously with the it's so clear now, and everyone's using open source, and there's a definition and there's standard practices. Wired Magazine declared open source as one. So what's next? What's new? We went from an era where Microsoft called the Linux community communism and Linux is a cancer that ties into that viral effect, to now, Microsoft loves Linux. Believe it or not, they're the largest contributor to Linux Foundation and the Linux project in terms of lines of code. At least they were last time I looked. Maybe someone else has taken over since then. 96 of applications includes some type of open source or free software somewhere in it. So maybe not the application itself. Think of Android or the tools, or think of other projects that have open source software part of them, even if the tool itself is proprietary. Linux Foundation and the To-Do Group. Well, To-Do Group represents a lot of commercial companies that have open source program offices or dedicated open source development departments within their companies. Did a survey, and 93% of those surveyed in commercial and industry are using open source code for non-commercial or internal reasons. So even if I'm not producing open source software, I make I don't know. I'm trying to look. I make coasters. I make stamps, hats, or something. I'm using open source software as part of my business to track my inventory or communicate or build my web page or do my client relationship management. Another 79% use open source as part of the commercial products, meaning I am a software company or I'm distributing something that's got a software component like a thermostat or an Internet of Things type device. They're using open source software. This is from Red Hat, shows the increase of open source software use. Here's a bunch of surveys around the growth of open source. 78% of companies claim that they run on open source. Only 3% say they don't. So now open source has become everything. We got open source hardware and open source robotics and open source drones and open source washing machines and open source design and open source furniture and open source fashion and open source photography and open source beehives and open source seeds and open source food and open source cola, open source beer, I think this is, brewing. So this is an old email, but I got an email asking if they can make open source cider, hard cider, but they want to make it open source cider. You see it quoted there. Once you have your open source cider, beer, and soda, you can make open source street lamps out of the bottles. We have open source learning, open source textbooks, open source courses, open source Shakespeare, open source buildings, use it for anything you want, open source festivals, music. I think this is open source religion. I don't know how that works. Open source government. So open source now is so popular that everything is open source. So the success of open source has brought around huge investment, marketing opportunities, promotional opportunities, where people want to align themselves with the ideals, the tenets, the communities, the innovation, the press, the marketing options that are opportunities that are all happening around open source, which basically means the open source label has become watered down. It's like, all right, what is organic? What is vegan? What is green? What's the standard that we can use to ensure that when I say my veggie burger is organic, how do I know it's really organic? What does that mean? What about if it being, let's see, what if the vegetables are not used with pesticides, but what do you think about, I don't know, the carbon footprint of the trucking that brings it there? Or what if it's vegan, but I don't know. How, what if the people using tools are wearing leather boots to harvest the vegetables? Does that count as vegan? So you can come up with any sort of criteria you want, and then what do? Just create a certified label on it, What's the standard that's going to be recognized to ensure that the expectations of the consumer are met? So in that article from Wired that said open source 1, they asked, now what? So, and in that they said there's a whole new, that open source community faces a whole new set of tests, right? The free software and open source is among the most important ideas in history of technology, and it now faces a new set of tests as it transforms from scrappy underdog to the pillar of mainstream. So a whole new set of tests, and those are legitimate questions to be asked. How do you understand if a project is mature and sustainable? Like, okay, is it just some fly-by-night couple of people got together and tried this and now they graduated and they're not going to do it anymore? So the project never really was that mature and it's not sustainable because those folks aren't there anymore and they don't have any way to keep it going. What about contributor? Let's say you do keep it going. What about burnout? You've got all these folks that are contributing hours and hours and hours, and they're not getting anything out of it. They're not getting paid. They're not getting recognized. They, and they just get burned out. They're tired of answering all your pull requests. They're tired of answering all your issues. They're tired of you, so that they just drop out. Are there business models? Okay, we're picking on Nooks. What is Nooks' business model? I mean, it's not open source, but what are the open source business models out there? How do you make a dollar just so you can be sustainable, so you don't have developer burnout? Is there a social impact and consequences to this? This touches on sort of the ethical use of software and the how do you ensure that the vision and ideals and ethics and morals of the developers, should they be reflected or carried on in the end users or not? Community development and management. How do you manage these groups? If you have a great successful project, but how do you manage governance and all the other things that make a project successful? And how do you assess that? New technologies and techniques as they emerge and evolve out of previous practice. How do you address those? Can you be agile enough to recognize them, to adopt them, to exploit them and leverage them? And then licensing, complexity and compatibility as you begin to, who manages all that intellectual property and make sure that it's consistent and legal to use all these different licenses. So those are all the tests around open source projects that you want to ask. And a lot of people are creating a whole new set of licenses to address these issues, right? So they recognize that there's not a business model, so maybe we can create a license that creates a business model. We recognize that people that we don't like, evil people, are using our cookie recipe for the evil bake sale, and maybe we can come up with a license for that. And here are some examples recently: the BSD plus patents license from Facebook, the cryptographic autonomy license, Commons Clause, which came out of this sort of database community, the do no harm and the fair source, which are, and the cable public license could be classified as ethical licenses, server-side public license, related to networks and shared resources. And then the 996 was child labor was a key feature to that one, which could be an ethical license as well. So let's go back to those 4 freedoms. The freedom to run the program as you wish for any purpose, the freedom to study how the program works and to change it so it does what you wish, the freedom to redistribute copies so you can help others, and the freedom to distribute copies in modified versions. So those are the 4 freedoms which are core to the open source definition. And again, the open source definition is core to the evaluation and certification of OSI approved licenses, and thus open source software. So these whole new set of tests and these whole new set of licenses have sort of created what I'm calling the 4 free sort of questioning, that doesn't sound right. So free 0 is to associate, or what might be called open washing, and that was defined. Open washing was to spin a project or company as free or open, although it is not. So it's sort of a marketing scheme. We want to associate ourselves with this popular movement, with this cultural and environment, this ethos, these ideals. But we're still a fully proprietary company. But we want to take your ideas. We want to help the community. There's sort of capturing both the technical development environment and also the community development environment. Then there's the freedom 1 is OpenSource. So that's software that claims to be open source, but is not actually distributed with an OSI approved license. Then there's the Nope in source. That's the Freedom 2. And that's invokes the benefits and values of open source, but places restrictions on users. So there might be core elements of open source software in there. They might be engaged in actual open source projects, but their products at the end, and we'll talk about business models around this, their products at the end of the day still include proprietary software, and worst of all, create vendor lock-in, where it ties you into using the software, so you're sort of trapped. And then there's the post-open source movement, which was, I think, best captured in a tweet that was sort of like, well, forget the license and governance, just submit it to GitHub. Sort of the GitHub generation of, oh, it's on GitHub, it must be free and usable, and I can take and do whatever I want with it. So looking at open washing, again, to spin a company or product as open, even though it's not. The best example I found is a project called the Ola Tablet. And it was, I first found it on Indiegogo. It also had a Kickstarter page. And it promoted itself as backed by open source power, active in the open source community, crowdsourced, working together, never saying it was open source, but affiliating itself and referencing open source projects that it might be using. So it'd be like me saying, Oracle is open source because some of its developers use Linux to develop or on it. I don't know, or they drive a car with an open source Linux infotainment system when they get to work. So they're definitely marking this as an open source tool. Or open source alternative to Android and iOS. And they got a lot of great press. Quotes are on the right from their Indiegogo page. It was going to be, they definitely didn't correct anyone when they misstated Sailfish, which was the operating system that they were developing for the Ola Tablet. That wasn't open source. That doesn't mean that Sailfish didn't have open source tools in it. But again, just as we explained before, a permissive license that allows you to embed open source tools in proprietary software doesn't make the output open source. It's proprietary. And their end user license agreement clearly stated this. The core components of open source of their software are free software, all available as open source via various projects. So they're core components, but not the Yola company's project or components. And although we encourage you to develop our software to make it better, they can't allow such development. This is right from their e-learning. There's a link down there. Although I think it's changed since then. This is probably a couple years old, so maybe they've changed their terms after we sort of hounded them for a while. And then license restrictions, you're prohibited from copying elements of the software. Clearly, that's a violation of the open source definition. You can't copy or redistribute or modify the software. And their end users didn't seem to like it. This is from the Sailfish community development page. Yola seems like they like the idea of community freedom, but closed source software is against both. Sailfish is closed source. It's anything remotely Yola specific is closed source. So again, talking about the difference between the embedded open source tools versus the Yola specific tools, and so on. And then I just looked up, I found the first comment was 3 years ago when their community was mad at them about misleading them. And then in March of last year, people were still complaining about the lack of open sourceness in their tool. But they did raise $2.5 million on Indiegogo. I don't know what they raised elsewhere. Then there's OpenSource. That's the free to assert. So it's a description of software that claims to be open source, but does not actually carry an OSI-approved license. So this is just flat out lying. So there is the OSIT Foundation submitted an RFP to the state of California for election software and claimed that their software was open source, to which we had to reply that it was not open source. So the RFP from the state was looking for open source software, so they simply just said, we'll call it the open OSET or the OSET public license, and it'll be open source. And even in their FAQ, it said, is your license truly an open source software license? They said that it was approved, and it hadn't been. To their credit, after being called out, they did submit the license, and it was approved. They had to do quite a few changes, but eventually they did get a license through. Cable license is Cable is an encryption company that does encryption software, and they said that their software was open source, but they put restrictions on it that governments, military, and like CIA intelligence organizations could not use it. And they said it was open source. So it would never have been open source. They never submitted it for review, and it wouldn't have passed because of those restrictions. But they announced it on all sorts of forums that they had this new open source encryption software. But again, after they were confronted with this, they've changed their language. So the soft cable is licensed under the QAPL, the Cable Public License, and is specially developed license which source code is open, but it's not approved by either the Free Software Foundation or the Open Source Initiative. So they updated their claims afterwards. Just more examples of why it wouldn't be. It can't be used for commercial use, and it can't be used for military, intelligence, or related purposes. The NOPE in source is the free to restrict, and again, this includes software that highlights the benefits and value of open source development ideals, but puts restrictions on. So these don't claim necessarily to be OSI or open source, but they say that these licenses allow all of the benefits, the network collaboration, and that open source licenses do, but they put these restrictions on them. So one example is a freemium. That's more of a marketing tool, but it's not open source, but you're free to use it, and there's usually restrictions around it. Open Core, this is quite, has become, it was very popular in the early 2000s, and it's become popular again. This is where some core component or technology is indeed open source, legitimately distributed with an OSI approved license. But then in order to really take advantage of the whole platform, not just the core technology, all the components or modules or extensions or add-ons or libraries or whatever you need to get the most out of it is proprietary. And that is particularly dangerous because what happens is people that might not be sophisticated enough in their evaluation of the license or open source software might say, oh, they're telling me this is open source, and they've got an open source community, and it seems then legitimate. And the open source software might even be managed by a community foundation rather than a company. But in order to get any real value, I have to use these other tools. Okay, I'll use this tool for doing, I don't know, database analysis, and this tool for creating a user portal, and this tool for integrating between different systems, blah, blah. And now I've become so entrenched in this open core technology that I can't migrate because all the real valuable tools are proprietary, and there's no way for me to modify those or migrate those, and now I'm trapped. So open core really risks vendor lock-in for those that adopt it. So the OSI has been sort of anti-open core for those reasons for a while. I won't go over it. I think I just did. Another issue is looking at commercial ownership versus, who owns the software. So who's the copyright holder? That's the organization or person who owns it. The best option is to have something, your open source project, be owned. Literally, the copyright holder is a nonprofit foundation that's got a governance model where an elected board of directors manages the intellectual property, the software, the patents, the trademarks, and so on. If it's an individual person or a company, remember, as the copyright holder, I can do anything I want to my original work. So I might release this today as an open source tool with the MIT license, but maybe tomorrow, the next version, I attach a proprietary license to it. Or as I'm the individual owner or a company, I might sell it, or my company might get bought, or I might get work for a new company. I sell it off or drop it or something like that. So this has happened a few times. Foundation DB, there's a big story when Apple bought them. One day people went onto GitHub and the repo was closed. And what happened to all the projects there? Well, the individual that owned it simply sold it off, and now Apple owns all that content. And they can choose now as the copyright holder to either continue it on as an open source project or under an open source license, or they can choose to change the license completely. This also happened. There's an article here about Strongloop and sort of their purchase and then and shutdown of a open source project that was competing with them. GeoGebra is another example. They offer a dual licensing model, which dual licensing is a legitimate option, but in this case, it doesn't work because normally with a dual licensing, you say, okay, we offer this as an open source tool or open source license. But if you're a company that doesn't want to have to conform to the GPL derivative issues where you're going to take the software and embed in proprietary, we'll sell you a one-off license that is under a proprietary license of the exact same software, but it alleviates you from having to contribute back your modifications. So that's a common example of dual licensing. So there's a copyleft license out there and a proprietary license. This, however, says, well, there's a GPL license that anyone can use. So I can take this and use it any way I want as part of my course to teach math. And that's great. But then it says if you're a company, you can't use that. You have to contact them. You have to buy the proprietary license. Well, the GPL allows for commercial use. It allows for the sale of that license. So that license does not restrict me in any way. But the folks at GeoGebra don't seem to understand that, and they're requiring people who want to use it for a commercial purpose to buy a new license. Now, if this ever went anywhere, I could simply say, look, I am now just using the GPL version. And there's no way I could take this and then give it to you, and you would never know because I've just given you a GPL licensed software because I can take this license, modify it, and redistribute it. So if I do that in compliance with the license, I'm not breaking any terms of the license. So this is just sort of a misunderstanding of dual licensing in the GPL. Oops, wrong way. The fair source license, this is not open source. They don't claim it is, but they want to try to promote the benefits of peer development, but they want to apply restrictions. So here's some comments from the fair source author: better to be 97% open than not at all. And it's a new way for folks to protect their work from what they would probably call commercial exploitation. So they want to allow anyone who wants to use their software for non-commercial purposes, they can use that. But if you're going to use it for some commercial reason, then you have to pay for the license. The do no harm license is really driven by sort of an ethical sort of viewpoint where there's a question of what role or what authority do the original authors have for determining the use of their software. So if I'm working all this time on it, can I limit how it's used so it doesn't conflict with my own political, moral, ethical standards? So for examples in the do no harm license, you can't use it for anything that results in, or if you profit from violence, hate, human rights abuses. They're all listed here. The Commons Clause was a amendment to the Apache license, and it places commercial restrictions. And this was really in response to cloud providers using open source software or providing ready packaged instances of open source software. And in this case, the companies felt that these cloud providers were not contributing back. They were taking advantage of the open source software to create businesses and capture customers, and they weren't contributing back to the projects themselves. They weren't paying for the companies. And again, this is an example of where a company, MongoDB or Redis DB, their open source software is owned by a company, and that company at the end of the day has to make money in order to keep the company going and theoretically the project going as well. And those companies were upset that Amazon was leveraging their software, enticing new customers, gaining new customers through the use of their software in the cloud hosting environments, and they weren't, in their thoughts, contributing back enough. So they wanted to limit the use of that. But again, they don't claim it's open source. They're just trying to capture the ideals and the benefits from a community of developers. So here's Common Clause, more information. And this led to a big question about it's time to re-examine open source, and is it being exploited by companies? I would actually argue that the companies that are exploiting open source are the very ones that are introducing these licenses. And again, I would point to the risk that one might take participating in and using software that's owned by a company, which at the end of the day does have to make $1, or else the project goes away, or could sell it off. And they're just sort of marketing and promoting themselves as open source rather than authentically engaging with open source communities. And you have to ask yourself, if you're at Redis Labs, or if you're a developer, why would you choose to participate? Why would I choose to donate my time so that Redis Labs can then sell this software? And if they expect Amazon to contribute back to Redis Labs for the use of their software, is Redis Labs going to contribute back to me personally for the contributions that I've made to Redis Labs? I mean, I just don't understand what value I'm getting out of this. I might have, I'm solving a problem and I'm contributing that problem back, but that's sort of a one-off. That's not going to build the type of community they probably want. And even if I do that, are they going to pay me from the money they get from Amazon? So they're upset Amazon is providing a platform to run Redis Lab and an easily point-and-click deployable auto magic solution, but they're not going to give me back anything from that. I mean, I wouldn't do that. Maybe others would. License 0, the prosperity. I like the prosperity license. You pay as a percentage of how well your company does. That's kind of novel. The last example is the PostOpenSource, and the free to ignore. This sort of goes into the GitHub generation. I don't know if that's fair, but that's sort of usually pointed at, where the idea is anything on GitHub must be open source. Just take it and use it. Sort of this free Wild West area. And if you looked at a while back in 2015, GitHub did a survey of how many licenses were included with the repos. And you can see it's a pretty small percentage. It has, since the introduction of the choose a source or choosealicense.com, which is a GitHub project to help people find open source relevant or the license, the open source license they want. And also updating when you create a repo, sort of at least introducing the idea of choose your license now. That percentage has gone way up. But it highlights that sort of this person on Reddit said, hello, I'm currently working on a web app, and I was thinking of making it open source. But is there anything else I have to do besides put it on GitHub? So that sort of highlights this idea of like, just put it on GitHub, it's fine. But folks should know that if there is no license, many jurisdictions regarding copyright would treat that as all rights reserved. So if I don't put a license with my work, the default in the US and many other places is that all rights are reserved, meaning nobody can use it unless they get your express permission, right? So they might be, the terms of GitHub and GitLab and related repositories, when you use it, whether you read it or not, it does say that people can view it unless it's a private repo. So you're giving GitHub permission to display your source code, but you're not giving anyone permission to use it in any way unless it has a license. That could be, you could stick a proprietary license in there. You could stick any license you want in there. But I think many people believe that just putting it out in the public, posting it on some web page somewhere makes it open source or usable, which is not true. So here's a quote from Richard Fontana, who was a former OSI board director, and he's the lawyer at Red Hat, specifically saying there's a whole great article on opensource.com about the impact of mislabeled license, not licensing, and so on opensource.com. Stack Overflow is another example. The idea is here is, you sort of get your question out there, then you copy and paste it into your, and how many questions do you have to ask before you've written a whole tool or application or app or whatever it might be. So here's an example. What are the rules there? The OSI did work with Stack Overflow, Stack Exchange to come up with licensing terms around Creative Commons licensing and open source licensing. So now the content is Creative Commons CC BY, and the code is MIT licensed. I found this the other day, or a while back now. Somebody tweeted "Work smarter, steal code," with the obvious caveat. And the only thing here that the person said was the only caveat is to make sure it works what you're doing. Thankfully, somebody pointed out that in addition to making sure it works, you should probably check to make sure that it's licensed appropriately. And then it turns out the example I'm showing you was from a story where a Nissan app developer was busted for copying code from Stack Overflow. That's the actual, this is actually the reference of the code they stole. So, even if it is MIT licensed, well, that's great. You can copy and cut it, but you still need to give attribution. You still need to comply with the MIT license. And if you don't do that, you're violating the terms of the license. And if there's no license associated, you can't just copy and paste it from GitHub because you don't have permission to do that. The license is the thing that gives you that permission. And here's the work we did related to the Stack Exchange licensing. The last example is sort of what's called sort of flossy, like glossy, sort of like the JPEG, compression where you get that sort of worms of pixels. And this has to do with sort of the post-open source idea of like, oh, just spin up your environment on some third-party cloud provider, and I'm using some open source tools, but I don't really know how the cloud provider's provisioning or managing or administering or monitoring or updating or any of those, administrative tools, and those might not be open source. Or my own management tools might not be open source, but that's okay. So there's a risk there of not understanding, there's a question that should be asked: how committed to free and open source software are you? And not that there's anything wrong with that, but you should realize that maybe even though you're using open source software tools for your infrastructure, for your project, for your company, the infrastructure that you're relying on supporting that might not be open source. So many of these same questions, is sort of 1 degree of separation of asking those same questions. So in the cloud on computers that they don't control might be running proprietary software and is not accessible. And therefore you're not enjoying all of the 4 freedoms that you should be because you're dependent upon proprietary software. And to be real snarky, whenever I go to open source conferences, I'm always amazed by the number of developers and project maintainers and startup people and who are professing the wonders and benefits of open source software as they deliver on their Mac or through PowerPoint or they pull up their Google Doc or whatever. So there's no, there's no, that is a bit of a value judgment, which is not nice. But, the benefits of open source don't just apply to the things that you're interested in. So as just a last sort of comment there, try to take advantage, if you believe in the open source ethos and the ideals, try to take advantage of as much open source as you can. And your use, even if you're not contributing in any way, will help grow the open source software movement. And that is, I'm all done. Is anyone still there?
Awesome. So
do we have less people?
We have one less people.
Okay.
So any questions? Anybody raise your hands if you want to. If not, I've got at least two.
Ah, okay.
So I'm still waiting for a raised hand, but I'll start off by asking. One of the things that this kind of revolves around the concept of companies who own the software, and there's two things I wanted to get your comments on. If you don't have a contributor license agreement, right, then you still own the copyright for the code you contributed, but you've contributed under the license, right? If the repository doesn't have.
So you're the company and I'm the contributor, and there's no CLA, right? Correct. So I should license my software before I give it to you, right? And if you're a company who accepts my contribution without an affiliate license, that's a red flag, right? Because a while back when Firefox had to change its licensing, it had to go and hunt down all these folks who either had a license and they discovered, conflicting licenses, or they discovered they had accepted contributions that didn't have any affiliated license, right? So my software that I'm contributing to you is under the license that I assigned to it when I contributed to you. Now I can choose to just use the same license. That's what I would do if I was working with a project, because then it just makes it easier for everyone. And if I've already contributed that to the same code to another organization, that's still my code. I can change. I can give it one license over here is the GPL, and that one over here is the MIT. Is that what you're doing?
Yeah. Does that mitigate somewhat against being able the repository owner being able to change licenses out from under you, because you're now in some ways protected, right?
Well, but only for my
right.
If I've contributed 95% of that project, great, because now I can give that 95% to everyone else. But if I've contributed 0.01% of that, and I'm relying on 99.9% of everyone else, and they sell it off, well, I mean, so yes, that's true. But there's real questions I would have about contributing to projects that are owned by individuals and companies. So
I was just thinking that it makes it a lot harder. If not, if I own 95%, but maybe I own 1%, and there's another 100 people out there that own, then it's a big deal to go through and change it to a. I mean, that's what Firefox had to go through, right? I mean, it was a major
right,
deal.
And that's why the CLA is.
Yeah.
You're handing over this. That doesn't mean just a CLA might say that you're giving a copy of this to them, and I'm not abandoning any of my claims of rights to this. Right. We share this. So, the CLAs can do all sorts of different things. It's just another agreement.
Cool. And one more, kind of along the same lines. If I own the software and I change and decide to release it under a new license, maybe a proprietary license, that doesn't affect, once I've given a grant of licensing, it doesn't affect anything that was previously licensed, correct?
Right. When you took hold of possession of that license, you accepted the terms for that at that time. So if in look how old I am, in 2018, if you took this software and it was under the Apache license and you're using it, and then the next version came out in 2020 or whatever the next year is, and they changed it proprietary, you can use that original work
And
That's what you can't use the next one.
You could even continue development on it.
Yeah, you could fork it and say, yeah. And this is I'm sorry, this is what's happening with Elastic and MongoDB. Once they added the Commons clause and the I forget the Redis license, and when they changed the license out, Amazon just forked the project and created a new version of Redis, MongoDB, and Elastic.
So it was relatively ineffective in changing the behavior they wanted to change.
Yeah, I mean, and they're losing, excuse me, and they're losing market share. I mean, why wouldn't you want your project to be the default, dashboard first click on install now at Amazon, right? I mean, but
yeah,
that's a whole other question about VC funding and other things that are driving those decisions.
Cool. Any questions from you guys? Come on, there's 23 of you left here. We've got a minute, 1 minute. All right, Patrick, thank you so much.
Sure.
I've heard you talk half a dozen times now, and I learned something new every time. I really liked your discussion on the dual licensing thing.
Folks there using GeoGebra? I think that's how you say it, right?
Maybe it's a different department.
No.
I use Qt a lot though. So that's kind of the one that always kind of annoyed me was we had we ran through a lot of hoops to make sure we were compliant with their license. When I was a commercial developer, we had a MIT, I think it was, licensed toolkit, and we would build proprietary and non-proprietary software from it, or contract out. We tried to avoid that whole open core stuff.
Right, that to me is the most vile of the things out there.
I mean, the software pretty much stood on its own, but if you wanted us to gen you up something special, we would do it for you, with the idea that you can,
well, I'm glad you've stepped away from the evil side of open core, and you're now teaching the wholesome, authentic core values of open source.
Although I do still have a Mac. I actually have a Mac, a Linux box, and a Windows box.
All right. Well, that's where our friendship ends. And I'm sure all of your students are rolling their eyes at me for being a dogmatic stick in the mud who, I always wait for the what are you running? And the class, I'll put this to you now. If you want to get Wes in trouble, ask him my thoughts about this whole Nooks thing and the torment I had to go through prior to being not due to any open source issue, but to the blatant proprietary traps associated with commercial software or proprietary software like this.
So I'm going to throw this out as a challenge. If any of you want to go on as your project, develop a replacement for Nook, I will use it. At least if it's remotely viable, I will use it.
Well, I heard you all were talking about if we go over, sorry, but talking about for the Arcos projects having a, really open source, because GitHub's not actually open source and GitLab is open core. So setting up Git and then building out your own sort of fully open source. There must be projects out there. I can't imagine there aren't. Shame on me for not knowing, but I can't imagine there aren't other universities that are doing this. Seems like a nice project.
Yeah, and it'd be easy enough to stand up, right? Git is completely open source. It's just a
yeah. And if anybody wants to get that extra credit easy A, any of the students out there, just go look at Jitsi or Big Blue Button, and because it's open source, just take it and fork it, and then spin it up and ship the URL over to Wes and get your extra credit A.
There you go. Perfect. We do have a couple questions, or at least one question. At what point would you personally choose a commercial software over its open source equivalent? As in, what are you willing to sacrifice to use certain types of
where's my software threshold?
Where's your threshold? Yeah.
Well, I do stop at stoplights. I do get on airplanes. I'm sure my car has all sorts of computer-controlled devices in it for fuel injection and the infotainment system and stuff like that. So, I think my line is any software that I can personally install, that I can personally manage, is where I always try to and have been successful so far in using open source or free software. Um, but I recognize the ATM machine, the traffic controllers, the jet airlines, all the cable television, all those systems. I don't know what's on there, and I can't control those anyway. So that's where I draw the line. I'm not Richard Stallman and refuse, to watch movies or I only use cash or whatever. But that's sort of my line. But everything else, I don't force it on my family. My son has an iPad. My older son, who's at RIT doing game development, is embedded in all sorts of proprietary software. I lecture them incessantly and play holier than thou and mock them, but they just tell me to shut up. So, but that's my line.
Cool. I'm seeing an 1110 Mr. Robot reference question too. I'm not sure what that means.
Oh, when they totally say GNOME wrong?
Ah.
I don't know if that's what it was. We used to watch that and try to slow down to see, yeah, Mr. Robot's a great series.
and there's much appreciation of the Evil Core reference. All right. I think we've held the students a little long, which is great because I'm amazed we still have pretty much a full cadre. So thank you. Again, much appreciated. We always love having you, and thank you for putting up with all the garbage.
Yeah. No, thanks for the invite. Good luck to the students. I'm jealous that you get to take an open source class in school. I never had that option. Didn't even know what that was. And best of luck to you all. And thanks so much again, Wes, for having me.
Thank you. You're very welcome. We'll talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye. All right, guys. I'm just going to let you guys go. I do have some notes on your on the paper, but that's not going to be due for a week and a half. And if you need Lab 4 to do it, so I'm going to just talk at the beginning of Lab 4. All right, we'll see you later. Enjoy yourselves. Thank you for your patience and for listening. Enjoy your Tuesday.